Hello, and welcome to Dark Echoes, a series where we will explore true crime stories, urban legends, and the paranormal. I'm your host, The Dark Suit, and I'll be showing you around my dark and creepy little world. So lock the doors, close the blinds, turn off the lights, sit back and enjoy. Dark Echoes. Ever since the 1920s, the residents of the small town of Anaconda, Montana, have shared rumors and stories of a woman known as Shoebox Annie, and for good reason. Annie French, known as Shoebox Annie and whose real name was Mary Eleanor Smith, lived at 623 East Commercial Avenue in the area of Anaconda known as Goosetown, with her son DeCastro Earl Mayer, who was also known as C.D. Montaigne and C.C. Skidmore. Annie was known for going around town and selling soap, shoelaces, illegal moonshine and other items out of a shoebox. She also had a pet magpie that could talk, which she carried with her as she went door to door selling soap. The magpie was also trained to steal jewelry and other items from dressers and tables. Annie was also known to steal. If you let her into your house, you could be sure that something would come up missing and that she would try to sell your stolen items to other people around town. The only way to get rid of her was to buy her soap or something else from her. The story around Anaconda at the time and still to this day is that Annie and her son would kill people and bury their bodies in the basement of their house, though no bodies were ever found on the property. Police suspected the mother and son of killing 4 people, 2 of which went missing during the time the duo lived in Anaconda. They believe Annie and Meyer would murder their victims by poisoning them, then dismember the bodies in a bathtub and either dissolve the body parts in acid or burn them. On September 14, 1928, Annie and her son were arrested in Oakland, California while driving a car that belonged to a man who was reported missing. James Eugene Bassett was from a wealthy family in Baltimore and was reported missing from Seattle, Washington. He left his home in Bremerton on Labor Day to drive to Seattle to sell his car and was never seen again. The pair in the car identify themselves as DeCastro Earl Meyer and Marie Smith. Marie claimed to be the man's 60-year-old mother. Meyer claimed they had bought the car from James Bassett prior to his disappearance. However, Bassett's watch and some valuable papers were found in the car, along with a poison gas pistol and a discharged gas shell. Police also found a scrapbook in the car that was filled with accounts of unusual murders and clippings from detective magazines. Both Smith and Meyer were held by Seattle police while waiting to be charged. Police continued to search for the body of James Eugene Bassett, but their efforts were unsuccessful. Nonetheless, Meyer was taken to Seattle to face charges filed by Chief of Detectives, Charles Tennant, and Deputy Prosecutor John Dunn, for the first-degree murder of James Bassett. Due to lack of evidence, the state of Washington was unable to convict the pair of murder. The Bassett murder was one of the most baffling cases in Washington state history due to the fact that no parts of the body were ever found. However, Smith and Meyer were convicted of grand larceny for stealing James Bassett's car. Smith was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison and Meyer was sentenced to life in prison as a habitual offender. Meyer had been in and out of prisons in several western states and had a criminal record going back 15 years or more. Then, on May 5, 1938, while still in prison, Smith, now said to be 73 years old, accused her son of 4 murders. John Shermer, deputy prosecutor for King County, Washington, said that investigators were able to extract a gruesome story from Mary Eleanor Smith of how her son, DeCastro Earl Meyer, had used a hammer to bludgeon James Eugene Bassett and then dismembered his corpse and hid the parts in various secluded places. It seems Mrs. Smith had been writing to a Washington state patrolman named Joe McCauley, who was posing as a clergyman. Smith wrote that her son had also killed a man and a woman in Montana and another man in Idaho. In the letters, Smith names the victims as Dorothy Lacasse of Butte, Montana, who vanished in 1923, Ollie Larson of Anaconda, Montana, who went missing in 1921, and a man named Randall from Idaho, whose body was buried in a stone quarry. In the letters, Smith states that Bassett was lured to the house where she and Meyer stayed under the pretense that they were interested in buying his car. Smith also claims she had nothing to do with murdering Mr. Bassett, saying, "I was sitting on the couch, where I had a rod of iron hidden in a quilt, in case of a struggle." Meyer forced Bassett to write a telegram to his sister in Bremerton. Then, after Mrs. Smith left the room, Meyer bludgeoned Bassett in the head with a hammer. Mrs. Smith writes in her letter, "I heard his body fall and went back into the room. He was gurgling. I stepped out again and Durrell gave him one more blow and it was all over. He never allowed his victims to suffer." Meyer then moved Bassett's body to the bathtub, where he dismembered his victim with a meat saw and a butcher's knife. Mrs. Smith wrote, "The poor boy worked so hard, to keep up his strength I made him an eggnog." The now dismembered body was placed in an iron tub and hidden in Meyer's bedroom for the night. Mrs. Smith said all of the body except the head and hands were put into 4 sacks and hidden under bushes in separate areas in the woods north of Seattle. The head and hands were thrown down a woodchuck hole in another location, she said. She was pretty proud of herself for outsmarting police, bragging about how she cleaned up the crime scene so well that officers found no trace of a murder when searching the house. "They made perfect fools of themselves," she wrote. "No wonder Earl and I got back to the old county jail in Seattle and laughed." As for Mrs. Dorothy Lacasse of Butte, Montana, who disappeared mysteriously in 1923, and Ollie Larson of Anaconda, Montana, who vanished in 1921. Meyer had been convicted of stealing a car in Bozeman, Montana in 1917 and was sentenced to 4.5 to 9 years in the Montana State Prison, which at the time was one of the harshest prisons in the country, but that's a subject for another video. Meyer was paroled in August of 1920, Larson vanished not long after. Larson had apparently sold some oil stocks and Mrs. Smith heard that he had gotten $800, after which Meyer invited Larson to his mother's house in Anaconda for a home-cooked meal. Ollie Larson was never seen again and his body sadly was never found. Meyer also charmed a woman, thought to be Mrs. Dorothy Lacasse, to come to Anaconda and visit his mother Shoebox Annie. It is believed that Mrs. Lacasse entered the residence at 623 East Commercial where she was slain, and then dismembered. In an August 3, 1988 article in the local newspaper, the Anaconda Leader, it is said that Mrs. Smith told police in Washington that one evening in November of 1923, her son brought Mrs. Lacasse home and sometime before noon the next morning she heard gunshots coming from the bedroom. She then saw her son drag the body of Mrs. Lacasse into the kitchen and dismember her, crushing the skull. Mrs. Smith said she then helped her son bury the remains in a roadside ditch running from the Anaconda smelter to Warm Springs. During an exhaustive investigation into the whereabouts of Mrs. Lacasse, police could find no trace of her body nor that of Mr. Larson, so no charges could be filed. However, bloodstains on the walls and bullet holes in the 5-room house prompted police to theorize that the murders were committed there. In her letters Mrs. Smith wrote of Mrs. Lacasse saying, "We threw away her pieces, they will never be found." It was the same with Larson and he was thrown in the same places. However, there is the case of the skeleton of a female found beneath the floor in a 42-year-old building in downtown Seattle. A sketch of what the woman might have looked like was sent to Butte, Montana Police Chief James A. Clark by Coroner Leo M. Sowers of King County. A copy was also received by the Butte newspaper in the hope that an identification could be made. The King County authorities thought that the skeletal remains might be those of Mrs. Dorothy Lacasse. A woman from Butte said the sketch basically resembles Dorothy Lacasse but that witness's name was never released. Was this the body of Dorothy Lacasse or is she buried in the ditch somewhere along the stretch of highway leading from Anaconda to Warm Springs? Meyer refused to corroborate his mother's confession and was placed on trial with her for the 10-year-old murder of James Bassett. Meyer took his own life in his cell at the King County Jail before he could be convicted of murder. The trial proceeded against Mrs. Smith, aka Shoebox Annie. She was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. She later died while serving her sentence. I was unable to find the date of Mrs. Smith's death. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to thumbs up and comment. If enough people like this video, I'll make more in the future.